Everyone's coming in. Gonna let people get here and get situated. Pour yourself a cup of coffee, pull up a chair, get ready. We're talking about one of my favorite topics, probably one of your least favorite topics. Coming up with a great forecast. So here we go. We're going to do it. We've got critical mass of people. There's about 60 or so people in the room. All right, we're talking about growth forecasting in an uncertain time. And boy, are we in an uncertain time. I am super excited to be here. I hope all of you are. Let's do this. Who am I? I'm Adam. I'm an EIR and program creator at Reforge. That means I teach and create programs. Program that I created is the Growth Leadership Program. Created that with Elena Verna, who was awesome. I also teach the Growth Series program in addition to Growth Leadership. I'm an advisor and an interim executive, used to be in-house at a bunch of interesting companies, just finished a stint at Resort Pass as an interim CPTO, was in Imperfect Foods, Patreon, Lyft, and write a newsletter, fishmanafnewsletter.com, and a podcast, startupdadpod.com. Who doesn't have a newsletter and a podcast these days? All right, enough about me. Here's how we're going to be spending our time together today. We've got 30 minutes. We're going to pack as much into this time as possible. I will talk fast. If you miss something, this will be recorded. Also, you can sign up for the Growth Leadership Program because we go way more in depth on this topic in that program. I'm going to talk about a 3-part forecasting framework for you, how to mitigate risk when you are doing your forecasting, and how to communicate to executives about your forecasts. And then if we have a couple extra minutes, I'm going to take some questions. So let's get started with our forecasting framework. The goal of forecasting is to communicate objectives and predictions in a way that your stakeholders can understand. Stakeholders, your team, executives, your company, sometimes also the board if you're a growth practitioner and leader. There are 3 reasons why forecasting is a colossal pain in the rear. The first is that company planning is usually very tops down. You get executives in a room, the FP&A team, they set some targets, and sometimes they then ask the leaders to validate those targets. So they come to you and they say, hey, you got to hit this number, hit it, make the forecast look like this. But the problem is us, functional leaders, growth leaders, we often approach planning from the opposite direction. We think about the work, think about it bottoms up, estimating and aggregating the impact of initiatives that we plan to tackle over a given time period. And then we build our plan from that. So that can be a little bit at odds with our executives. Second thing, planning is more ambiguous for growth than it is for other functions. I know we're all special snowflakes in growth. The work involved is so experimental, and growth teams are repeatedly testing new hypotheses to try to figure out what's going to have the most impact, that it makes it really challenging to predict specific impact or which metrics you might move. The third reason this is really hard is because well-intentioned growth leaders, that's all of us, sometimes bring way too much optimism into the planning process. You create unrealistic expectations. You want to be hopeful, but sometimes you're pressured to be overly optimistic. Every single time that I have been too hopeful in my predictions, I end up being wrong. Being wrong when you're in growth means somebody yells at you. Sometimes you lose your job. That's a bummer. So, how are we going to get better at this? We're going to look at 3 parts to future growth work planning. I'm going to quickly explain all 3 of these today. A baseline forecast, a growth expectations forecast, and number 3, an executive forecast. Let's get started. Building a baseline forecast is pretty straightforward. You follow 3 steps. First, you create an end-to-end quant model that shows how your user growth works across all of your loops. Then you identify and analyze the constraints in that model, and you add them to your model. And then third and finally, you attach dollar amounts to your forecast. Let's use an example. Some of you have heard of Strava. Strava is a cool company. we're going to start and look at last year's monthly end-to-end baseline model. So if you're Strava, you have a model, shows you your performance in your acquisition loops. Specifically talking about acquisition loops at this moment. Let's assume Strava measures growth in MAUs, monthly active users. In this sheet, you can see every step of the company's acquisition loops, all the way from traffic down to activation. This is an example. This is dummy data, so bear with me. If you then go deeper into each acquisition loop for the company, say like the viral invite loop, you can break each one of those down into its component parts. You get a forecast for each individual loop based on last year's performance. You add them all together, you get a total number of newly activated users, for example. This becomes part of our baseline forecast for acquisition loops, and it's an element of your end-to-end quant model. Now, the second step that you do once you come up with this model is you identify constraints and you add them to your model. You do this by looking at individual variables within the model. So for example, in our previous Strava example, that might be things like click-through rates, conversion rates, the branching factor on invites. And what you do is you then run those out on a weekly or monthly basis to the end of the year, and you estimate whether you think they're going to get better or get worse or stay the same based on the work that you're doing. So this gives you the input value of each variable throughout the year, and then you can compare them to create a year-over-year model. You're incorporating all of this into your end-to-end model and lathering, rinsing, and repeating for monetization loops and retention loops. So this gets you to your baseline. If we did nothing, what do we think would happen with these variables? Therefore, what would happen with our baseline? So for example, with Strava, the company might anticipate diminishing performance in the third month of the year. Why? I don't know. This is hypothetical. And then your activation rate is expected to take a huge hit at some point in the year too. And then it's going to change and course correct and trend positively by the end of the year. Maybe this is related to seasonality. Maybe it's related to planned work or something like that that you already know is committed to. You're running this out for the year and you're figuring out what is that going to do to the inputs of your model. Then the final step is you attach a dollar amount to that impact. So you use the baseline monthly subscription price if you're Strava. That helps you calculate a monthly recurring revenue. Strava's subscription price, for example, is $6.67 if you bill it annually. Okay, so that's baseline. Now you might be thinking, gee, Adam, what about those other two forecasts that you mentioned? How do I handle the uncertainty? Isn't that the title of this talk? Yep, sure is. So let's talk about how to mitigate risk and account for uncertainties. This is where the second forecast comes into play. This is the growth expectations forecast. This is an internal only forecast, internal to your team, and it accounts for the projected impact of your growth work. Remember, growth work is uncertain, but that's okay because without that uncertainty, it wouldn't be necessary. If you already knew exactly what would and wouldn't work, you just organize a bunch of teams around that and you'd execute. But that's not how this works. Still, there is a lot of pressure to derive impact. Remember, this is why this forecast is for your eyes only. The growth expectations forecast reflects your team's expectation of growth over the period. This is what you might set internal goals against. This is how you might measure the success of your team when it comes to promotion time. There's inevitably going to be some differences between what you think and what other people think, and this is why you keep this internal to your team. Don't let it leave the room. Your eyes only. There are three parts to the growth expectations forecast: measuring the uncertainty of your projections, adjusting them to account for that uncertainty, and then layering in the projected impact of our growth work into the baseline forecast. The source of your assumptions is going to dictate the level of confidence in each piece of growth work. So if there's a spectrum and you have discounted assumptions, discounting, which refers to the reduction in the impact that you think an initiative will have based on how confident you are, you're going to want to discount a lot, at least 70%, if you're using something like market benchmarks. That's all the way on the left. You're going to discount less if you're using your own historical data. So if you have first-party evidence, discount less, maybe around 30%. The other variable that factors into our growth expectations forecast is the portfolio of experiments and the type of work involved. Here, there is a spectrum between optimizations on one end and innovations on the other end. And depending on those, that's what is going to adjust your level of confidence and your discounting percentage. Let me give you 3 examples. First example, we're optimizing a part of an existing loop or a process. You need to figure out which conversion variable you're working with to improve, the timing of the improvement, and you're forecasting by folding that into the existing loop model in your baseline forecast. You are layering these in, and you need to discount the assumptions behind each initiative according to those discount benchmarks that we previously covered. So if it's an optimization, you're probably not discounting as much because you're tweaking, you're adjusting. A mistake made in projection here is not going to be that detrimental. Second scenario, let's say you're optimizing a step in the user journey. This might look like something like an onboarding experience, or you're making updates to a checkout experience, something that every single person is going to touch, which is different than an individual loop. Here, because the impact is going to be felt across all of your loops, you're going to want to factor this in and the adjustments into your end-to-end quant model. So you bring these into your end-to-end model, and you will discount the assumptions that support each initiative using the same discounting benchmarks. But this is impacting your end-to-end model versus a single loop. The third scenario is, let's say you're standing up an entirely new loop. Hey, we're going to go figure out how to do this viral loop that doesn't exist today. Good luck to you, by the way. Here you need to build out a net new single loop model. First, you build out an entirely new single loop quant model. Then you add it to the right growth stage, acquisition, retention, or monetization. And this addition isn't accounted for in your baseline or your end-to-end model. So you need to compensate more heavily for the uncertainty of it and apply a bigger discounting benchmark to the output. And the output gives you your new loop forecast. Okay. In the Reforge Growth Leadership Program, we provide a ton of examples of how to do this in excruciating detail, building off the Strava case. I cannot cover all of those today. You'll just have to sign up to see it. Okay, let's talk about a final topic. Everyone's favorite topic, how to communicate all of this with your executives. Your executive team's going to come to you like this. Show me the money. That's ultimately what they care about. They want the dollars and cents. The first thing to remember when you are creating an executive communication plan is interactions. Interactions between the different elements of your work can either amplify or cannibalize the impact of other initiatives. This is very important. Just like we did with discounting, the evidence that you have around these interactions will inform how much you should include in the forecast you show to your executives. Add the interaction impact to your growth expectations forecast. You can build a toggle so that you only have to work in one document if you want, but you want a discounting percentage for the executives. This is where my favorite term, the fudge factor, comes into play. A fudge factor, technical term here, is a sweeping discount to the growth expectations forecast that gives you your executive forecast. The more time you have spent at a company, the smaller your fudge factor should be, because the better your knowledge of the inputs and outputs should be. Over time, your ability to discount assumptions as you build your growth expectations forecast will get a lot more accurate. So you won't have to leverage a fudge factor as much to discount at the end for executives. As a general rule of thumb, I like to start with a 30 to 40% discount. Eventually, you might get to a 15 to 25% discount. Maybe eventually you get to a 0% discount, although I don't recommend it. In an ideal situation, you have a very conservative CFO or finance leader, and they just want to take your baseline forecast and use that. However, that is not usually the case. Most executives won't be looking at your quant growth models. They're not going to care. So you have to translate your models into revenue targets for the executive team and then use those targets to communicate the gaps within your growth work. That's a gap analysis. Cool. When you communicate your forecast, there are 4 main pillars that matter. The first pillar is context. The way to provide context is to share expected timing and expected growth upside while disclosing the key uncertainties in your projections. In the second pillar, you talk through how the different scenarios might play out. This could be known accelerants in your growth, for example. And really here, I want to caution you to avoid the classic, what do you need trap. When you are talking with executives about scenario planning, one of an executive's favorite things to do is to say, what if we gave you unlimited resources? What would be possible? Sounds awesome. The problem with buying into this wholeheartedly is that it takes months to hire and onboard the right people. So they can give you all the resources on the planet, and you're not going to see results for 6 to 8 months. Do not put those into your forecast. Wait. This is a common mistake. If the people are not in the building right now, they're not influencing your next couple quarters. Full stop. The third element of communicating with executives is risks. You want to highlight any risks that might undermine or derail your forecast. For example, adding a net new loop might be a big risk. It probably is, unless you have a lot of evidence to support it. I also think that we tend to wildly overestimate our impact on things like retention specifically. So be wary when you are making forecasting projections around retention. It is a very hard thing to move. You will not move it by massive percentages, and it will take you a long time to figure out what to do there. The last pillar is the support pillar. This is your time to campaign for the support you need to execute the work you need to do. For example, this might be not necessarily asking for resources, but asking for an executive to support your OKRs, to point other people in the direction of your team so that you can get what you need, to clear a path for you to work collaboratively with other people who are already in the building. That's the support part. It could also just be support me in understanding and communicating that there are different scenarios at play here and there are some risks involved. That's it. All right. Those are the pillars of your communication to executives. Remember, context, scenarios, avoid the what do you need trap. It's a trap. I'm telling you. Watch out for risks. Make sure to ask for the support that you do in fact need. Okay. Some key takeaways for you. Number one, Start with your baseline expectations forecast. If you do not have a end-to-end quant model, build it. Start with your loops, add in retention loops, add monetization loops. We literally give you a step-by-step guide how to do this in the Advanced Growth Strategy program at Reforge. I have taught that program many times. It is wonderful. It is very dense, but it is all about building growth models. So there you go. Get that content. Then you add your internal growth expectations forecast on top of it. Remember, this is internal to you. This is not the thing that you are going out there and blabbing about to executives. This is your team. This is what you use to motivate them, but you also want to keep it realistic. Okay. Number 2, always, always, always discount relative to your level of confidence in the initiative, the timing of the initiative, and the interactions between the variables that you are working on. And if you are being very optimistic, remember, you are probably wrong. Everything will take slightly longer than you think and won't work as well as you think. So give it a haircut. Number 3, when you are communicating with executives, you want to focus on the 4 pillars: context, scenarios, risks, and the support that you need. Avoid the what do you need trap. Executives love to set it. It's going to happen. Also, be very wary of your overexuberance in thinking about how big of an impact you will have on something like retention or monetization, something like that, especially retention. Retention is really hard to move. So that is that. Those are my key takeaways. And with that, going to breathe a big sigh. And I'm going to move to Q&A. Does anyone have a question? We have one from Andre. Andre? Sean, I don't know. Can people actually unmute and ask their question, or is that a no?
Yeah, go for it. No,
Andre,
go for it.
You still there? Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I'm there. I'm here. So
ask.
Thanks for your content here, man. Just for a little bit of context here, I work in a company that are a service B2C company. So we sell services here. We are a marketing company, like a marketing technology company. So if you are building that kind of growth forecast, what do? You use the same steps? Because when you are looking for our services, a software as a service company, there are some different things as than a service company. So what do you do here? You do the same steps, and why?
Yeah, I don't actually think that you would do much different. The only thing that might be different are the variables that you have to consider. You're still looking at how are we acquiring new customers to our services? How are we retaining those people? How are we growing revenue from them over time? And so it doesn't have to be a physical or virtual product. You can still apply the same approach, the same discounting structure, etc. You may focus more if you're a services business. You may focus more on revenue expansion from existing people, because that might be a bigger component of your model, say monetization expansion, than maybe net new acquisition. So that might be a difference, but all the steps are the same. It's just where you have to lean in to that forecast. So there you go. Cool.
Okay, so here my biggest problem here are that we are almost all the time looking for linear growth.
Yep.
So that's on my main challenge right now, because I'm here working. How could we create compounding growth, and how could we build a forecast for that? Because almost all the time our directors, our C-levels are looking for, okay, man, can you do here?
Great question.
Plan.
Let me tell you how you do that. If you've got linear growth, that means you're mostly working on linear channels. You need to figure out if you have a loop to exploit. A loop, which we cover extensively in the growth series in the advanced growth strategy program at Reforge, will give you compounding growth. Not every business has a loop, but if you think critically about it, you can typically get there. And that is, how does the output of the thing get reinvested into the input to create like a closed cycle? And with that, I'm going to move on to a couple of other people who have their hands up. So Kate, what do you got for me?
Hello. So I work on B2B and B2C software sales and marketing data science. And one of the things we have struggled with is incorporating macroeconomic trends into our models. Like we tried to pull in layoff data. We tried to do funky things with like GDP and interest rates of countries, but it was like adding more thrash. Any suggestions?
Ooh, great question. Sometimes that can be very effective. For example, Instacart used COVID data, as in people who had COVID cases, the number of them, to predict demand for their service during the peak of the pandemic. That data source was very structured. It was easy to get, and it was very correlated and causal to their performance. And it was like a 2-week lag. I literally just had this conversation with their head of growth yesterday, who is, by the way, guest in week number 2 of the growth leadership program. Other stuff is harder, both because the data is super messy and also it is macro data, right? So it's, it's hard to layer that in. What I would do in that case is you might create a little sensitivity toggle that says like, hey, there's a few different scenarios. Let me give you an example. At Lyft, when it rained, demand went up for the service. So we knew how much it went up depending on the weather. And so we could say, hey, we're in the rainy season. Let's add this toggle to our baseline and everything's going to jump by like 15%, for example. So that's about the best you can do. But yeah, I would agree that there's a lot of macro environmental things that you can't predict. We have this happen at Patreon. Suddenly YouTube would decide that they were demonetizing a bunch of creator videos and creators would come running to the platform. And like, how are you going to predict that? The best thing that you can do is just watch why people are saying that they're coming. And if you notice that trend, build that toggle so you can turn it on or off. But that's kind of about it. I wish I had a better answer for you. Okay. Adrian. Adrian has a hand up. What's up, Adrian?
Hi there.
Got to keep it brief.
Yeah, I will try. I'm so this is not this is my weakness. To be brief and concrete, to be honest.
We all have something to work on, Adrian. It's okay.
Yeah. This is my kryptonite. So greetings from Poland. Actually, I have a question because I did this kind of retention engagement already on Reforge. I know that you are like a rock star here on the Reforge. Everybody recommend your courses, and so I wonder, because I'm struggling, I'm responsible for CRM and marketing automation. I have the similar case to Andre because I work for the service company. We are focused on selling, sales media, and like paid ads. We are like 400 people right now in Poland.
Yeah.
And we are going to expand our operations to United States. So, and I would like to learn this kind of framework thinking, how to help, for example, e-commerce companies grow. Already use, for example, this kind of retention loops and content loops in my work. And my question is, what do I learn from this course? Do I learn something like I could apply to any client, any business?
Great question. Growth leadership is going to give you more soft skills about how to run a growth team and organization and how to work cross-functionally with other peers in other departments and how to manage your own growth career. Actually, the 4 pillars are planning your career, balancing goals, organizing your team, and expanding your team. So that's not going to give you a lot of tactical advice for building models and things like that. Maybe the forecasting one will give you like a deeper dive on what we just talked about. Better for you to take deep dive programs like advanced growth strategy, the growth series more generally, growth marketing, MarTech, like that sort of thing. Those are going to give you more like practical, I can immediately go execute against this. And it's less about running the team and more about like your day-to-day work. So I would advise you to look into those types of programs. If you are looking to be a better growth leader and to do these 4 things, then this program is great. But we're not going to cover like, how do you launch in the United States? That wouldn't be covered in this. I do think there's probably an interesting program around international growth that could be there, but
probably. But this is not my case, to be honest. I just mentioned that we are expanding to United States via New Zealand company, but it's about thinking frameworks. For me, it's like a system thinking is the best way to challenge any problem that you come up in your career. So this was my question. Thank you very much for taking the question.
We are past time, but I've got a few more minutes. So I wanted to just address a question that a guy named Chris asked. Hi, Chris Wyatt. I'll just read your question, but I know you're still here. Why is retention the hardest to improve? What is the most common variable that is the trap in retention? Ooh, great question. The reason retention is so hard to improve, in my opinion, is because it is like deeply rooted in user psychology. And it's deeply rooted in like a whole bunch of things around time to value, price, how somebody arrived at your product, what their like predetermined points of view are. It's heavily focused on your onboarding experience. And so it's not just, a lot of people think, well, if I just email people, they'll come back. No. It's also really hard to resurrect people once they've decided that your product's not for them. So that's one of the reasons I think it's really hard. Most people can improve retention, but their retention is already kind of what it is at launch and has a lot to do with product market fit and things like that. So that's why I think it's super hard. All the other channels are hard too. Acquisition is challenging. Monetization is challenging, but they are a little bit more real time in their nature of feedback, whereas retention can also be lagging, which is another reason that it's hard. So those are some of my my takes on this, even though I work with a lot of companies on retention, and we are successful. So that is that. That's my last question. Sean, anything to say?
Nothing. That was great, Adam. Thank you all for joining. Encourage you all to enroll in Adam's growth leadership course or one of the others available this fall. A lot of them are kicking off next week. Follow up with hello@reforge.com if you have any questions about enrollment, anything like that. And Adam, thank you for your time. That was great.
Thank you for having me. I hope to see many of you around the Reforge hallways. And thank you for the great questions too. Super appreciate it. Take care, everybody.